The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. The Lord said, "Woe to you, Pharisees! You pay tithes of mint and of rue and of every garden herb, but you pay no attention to judgment and to love for God. These you should have done without overlooking the others. Woe to you, Pharisees! You love the seat of honor in synagogues and greetings and marketplaces. Woe to you! You are like unseen graves over which people unknowingly walk." Then one of the scholars of the law said to him in reply, "Teacher, by saying this, you are insulting us too." And he said, "Woe also to you, scholars of the law! You impose on people burdens hard to carry, but you yourselves do not lift one finger to touch them." The Gospel of the Lord. So in today's first reading, St. Paul says that if you are guided by the Spirit, then you are not under the law. Not under the law, as in the law being a burden, is how St. Paul understood the law. I think this is a good opportunity for us to dive a little bit deeper into the letter of Galatians and how it is in some ways kind of a summary of salvation history. Yesterday we talked about circumcision and why we don't need to have circumcision anymore. We talked about how it's been replaced by baptism, and we also said that there were different aspects of the law in the Old Testament. Some aspects of the law were meant to last forever, and some aspects of the law were meant to be only for a period of time. I want to talk a little bit more about that today. We're going to go pretty in-depth this morning, so I know it's only 7:30 in the morning, so try to follow and stay awake here, but I think it is significant, and it's kind of mind-blowing and eye-opening when you begin to see some of these things and you begin to understand all of salvation history. Right? So it's important to understand when we read the Bible in the Old Testament, there are many different covenants that come up in the Bible, right? So originally there was a covenant with Abraham. And then the next covenant was a covenant with Moses. The next major covenant in the Old Testament was a covenant with King David, right? There are these different covenants in the Old Testament. And in the days of Abraham and Moses and David, in that culture, there were different kinds of covenants you would enter into. Right? Covenants was not just something that God did with his people. It was something that nations would do with other nations and kings would do with other kings in those days. And there are different kinds of covenants. There were two basic kinds of covenant. One was a kinship covenant, in which when somebody would do something great for someone else, they would be rewarded by that person, and they would make a covenant of kinship, as in they would kind of be treated as family members from that point on. Right? So you could think about the covenant of marriage as something similar to this. But then there was a different covenant that was more like a covenant between a ruler and his servant, or a ruler and his vassal. And that covenant was very different. Oftentimes, it was a castigatory covenant, right? A covenant of punishment. And so the result was not that the two people treated themselves as kinsmen, but rather as a ruler and a slave, a subordinate covenant. So in the Old Testament, likewise, there are different kinds of covenants that God makes with his people. Sometimes the covenant is a covenant of kinship as a reward to his people. But some covenants are the other kinds of covenants in which his people are then treated as vassals or slaves, and it's more out of punishment. Okay, have we followed me a little bit so far? Different kinds of covenants. One kind of covenant is really good. Another kind of covenant is not so good. All right? Now, the major covenants of the Old Testament, some of the covenants God gave were the good kind, in which he brought his people into kinship, into his family. So, for example, in the time of Abraham had his famous episode where he went on Mount Moriah and was to sacrifice his son Isaac. Right? And in response to that, in response to Abraham's trust and fidelity, God made a covenant with him. And he said, "Through you, all of your descendants will bless the world, and your descendants will be as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore." It was a great reward that God gave to Abraham. Right? That was the first major covenant, the Old Testament. And likewise, in the time of Moses, God, remembering his promise to Abraham, brought the Israelites out of Egypt, took them to Mount Sinai, and he made a covenant with them, in which Moses wrote down the Ten Commandments. Right? The many Jewish commentaries, ancient Jewish commentaries, they describe that as God's wedding with his people. God was wedding himself to the people of Israel. It was a great covenant of reward to his people, bringing them into his family as if it was a marriage. But do you remember what happened right after God received the Ten Commandments? The covenant of Mount Sinai. Something really bad happened. The golden calf. Very good. Mr. Utterback is following me here. So right after God made this great covenant with his people on Mount Sinai, he discovered that they had made for themselves a golden calf and worshipped it. And so because of that, God had to make a new covenant with them. The bad kind of covenant in which they were treated more as slaves and vassals. And that's where we get the book of Deuteronomy from. The book of Deuteronomy literally means the second law. And that second law was never meant to last forever. It was meant to only be for a time. And it was a law of punishment for God's people. And through the rest of the Old Testament, we see that God's people continually broke that law and broke that covenant. And so because of that, they were under the curse of the law. In the last 3 chapters of the book of Deuteronomy, it actually describes the blessings and curses that go along with the law. If God's people would follow the law, they would be blessed. But if they broke his laws, they would be cursed. And that happened at different times in salvation history. In 587 BC, as a result of the people's sinfulness and lack of fidelity to the law, they were taken into exile, and the temple was destroyed, and Jerusalem was burned. It happened again even after the time of Jesus. It happened in 70 AD, which you'll hear me talking about a lot whenever we talk about the Bible. But think about this. God originally made this great covenant with his people Israel on Mount Sinai, and then it was broken, so he had to make a transitory covenant, one that was not supposed to last forever, and one which treated them as slaves. St. Paul, at his time, there are Jewish Christians who are saying that they still need to follow the rules of that old transitory law, the book of Deuteronomy, with all of the different regulations that came with it, including the law of circumcision. And St. Paul tells them that that is no longer necessary. Why? Why? Well, in Galatians chapter 3, St. Paul says this: all who rely on the works of the law are under the curse of the law. Speaking to all these Jewish Christians who have not fulfilled that old transitory law perfectly. Those who are under the law are also under the curse of the law. So those who want to keep those old regulations, those who want to stay in that old law, it's like they're saying, we don't want to be members of God's family. Instead, we want to be his slaves. St. Paul goes on just a little bit further. He quotes something from the book of Deuteronomy with reference to the curse. What St. Paul says is this, Galatians 3, verse 13. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For as the book of Deuteronomy says, cursed is every man who hangs on a tree. Are you following me a little bit? Jesus literally takes the curse of Deuteronomy on himself by being hung on a tree on the cross, thereby releasing his people forever from that very curse of the law which all of them were subject to, and therefore returning us to the original covenant he had made with Moses at Mount Sinai, a wedding between God and his people, in which God's people are no longer treated as slaves and vassals, but rather as sons and daughters, as members of his family. Really cool, right? Really amazing. Some of these minor things that you can just kind of overlook in the Bible, when we take the time to really dive deep and look into them, all sorts of amazing insights can come for us.